Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
The day my mom forced me to cover my stepmom's bills, I thought I was just doing my duty as the responsible one in the family. What she didn't know was that I had a secret, a trump card that would turn the tables and reveal who was really in charge of the family finances. It was a Wednesday evening, and I was halfway through reheating leftovers when my phone buzzed with an incoming call. It was my mom. This wasn't unusual. She called often, sometimes just to chat. But something in her tone when she greeted me made me pause. It wasn't the warm, "Hey, sweetheart," I was used to. Instead, her voice was brisk, almost businesslike. "I need you to help Karen out," she said without preamble. I blinked, caught off guard. "Help Karen? With what?" "She's a little behind on some bills, and I thought you could step in and help her out," she said, her tone light, as if she were asking me to pass the salted dinner. For a moment, I thought she had to be joking. Why on earth would I be responsible for Karen's bills? My stepmom and I had never been close, and honestly, I'd always suspected she didn't like me much. She was polite enough when we were all in the same room, but there was always an air of tension between us. "I don't understand," I said carefully. "Why would I pay Karen's bills?" My mom sighed heavily, as if I were being deliberately obtuse. "Because she's family, and she needs help. She's done so much for us." "For you," I interrupted. "She hasn't done anything for me." That was the wrong thing to say. My mom's tone sharpened instantly. "Don't be selfish," she snapped. "Karen has been there for me through thick and thin, and now that she's struggling, we need to support her. You're the most financially stable person in the family, so it only makes sense for you to step up." I felt my stomach twist. "Mom, I have my own bills to pay. I can't just—" "I expect you to do this," she said firmly, cutting me off. "Karen needs help, and as a family, we take care of each other. You know how much she's done for us. The least you can do is cover her bills until she gets back on her feet." Her words hit like a punch to the gut. There was the guilt trip. My mom had always been good at it, twisting things until saying no felt impossible. I was the responsible one, the one who had a steady job and savings. Compared to the rest of the family, I was doing well, and my mom never let me forget it. Later that night, after I'd reluctantly agreed to help out, my mom sent me a list of Karen's overdue bills. I expected it to be a few small things, maybe a missed utility payment or an overdue credit card. Instead, I was hit with a laundry list of expenses: the electric bill, her car payment, a gym membership, and even a subscription to some high-end skincare box. The total was staggering. I stared at the numbers, my chest tightening. This wasn't a case of falling behind on essentials. Karen was living beyond her means, and now I was expected to bail her out? I paid the bills, gritting my teeth the entire time. This is a one-time thing, I told myself. I'll help her out, and then it's done. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't be that simple. Sure enough, it wasn't. A week later, my mom called again. This time, it was Karen's mortgage payment that needed covering. "It's just this once," my mom assured me, her tone almost soothing. "She's been under a lot of stress lately, and she really needs a break." I wanted to say no. Every fiber of my being screamed that this wasn't my responsibility. But my mom had a way of making refusal feel like a betrayal. She'd raise her voice just enough to remind me of her authority, slip in a few reminders about everything she'd done for me. And before I knew it, I was opening my wallet again. The worst part was that Karen didn't even acknowledge the help. No thank you text, no phone call, nothing. Meanwhile, her social media was full of pictures of her latest shopping sprees and posts about treating yourself. It was infuriating. For the first time, I started to feel real resentment, not just toward Karen, but toward my mom as well. She'd forced this burden onto me without a second thought, all because I was financially stable. But how long would that last if I kept bleeding money for someone else's irresponsibility? Something about this didn't sit right with me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more going on here than my mom was letting on. I decided then and there that I needed to find out the truth, no matter what it took. I tried to convince myself that paying Karen's bills was the right thing to do, that helping her out was just a temporary inconvenience. After all, family was family, right? But the moment my mom emailed me the full list of overdue payments, I knew I was in way over my head. Karen's debts weren't small. They weren't even reasonable. What I'd initially pictured as a couple of late utility bills turned out to be a financial disaster. Multiple maxed-out credit cards, several months' worth of subscription services, and a gym membership that cost more than my own rent. The total added up to more than I'd ever spent in 1 month, even during the holidays. I stared at the list, feeling a mix of disbelief and anger. This wasn't just about catching up on essentials. Karen had been living way beyond her means, and now I was expected to clean up the mess. Still, I told myself it was a one-time thing, a favor to keep the peace. Reluctantly, I dipped into my savings and transferred the money, ignoring the gnawing voice in the back of my mind telling me this wasn't fair. A week passed, and I was just starting to feel like I could move on when my phone rang again. It was my mom. "Hey, honey," she said, her tone overly sweet. I knew immediately that she wanted something. "I hate to bother you again, but Karen's car payment is due, and she's a little short this month." I clenched my jaw, gripping the phone tighter. "Mom, I just helped her last week. I can't keep doing this." "Oh, I know, and we're so grateful," she said quickly, brushing off my protest. "But this is just one more thing. After this, I'm sure Karen will be back on her feet." Her words felt hollow, but the guilt trip was already creeping in. I could feel myself caving, just like I had the first time. Against my better judgment, I agreed. Then came a next call. This time, it was Karen's mortgage that needed covering. "She's trying so hard," my mom said, her voice tinged with that same manipulative sweetness. "This will really help her get ahead." By now, it was becoming clear that this wasn't just a temporary favor. It was turning into a pattern. Every week, there was a new expense, a new emergency that Karen apparently couldn't handle on her own. And every time, my mom framed it as my responsibility, like it was my duty to step in because I was the stable one in the family. What made it worse was Karen's complete lack of gratitude. She never acknowledged the help, not even a simple thank you. It was as if my contributions didn't exist. But what really set me off were her social media posts. While I was stretching my budget to cover her bills, Karen was posting photos of expensive dinners, spa days, and designer shopping hauls. One day, she shared a picture of a new handbag, complete with the caption, "You deserve the finer things in life." #blessed. I stared at the post, my blood boiling. That bag alone probably cost more than the payment I'd just sent for a mortgage. I couldn't believe the audacity. Not only was Karen taking advantage of me, but she was flaunting it for the world to see. I tried bringing this up with my mom, hoping she'd understand how unfair it was. But every time I voiced my concerns, she brushed me off. "She's been under a lot of stress," my mom would say. "You have no idea what she's going through." And just like that, the guilt trip would work its magic. I'd give in, transferring the money with a heavy heart and telling myself it was the last time. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. At some point, I started keeping track of how much I was spending. Over the course of 2 months, I'd funneled thousands of dollars into Karen's bills, more than I'd spent on myself all year. Meanwhile, my savings were dwindling, and my own financial goals were slipping further out of reach. The worst part was the feeling of helplessness. Every time my mom called, I felt like I had no choice but to say yes. She'd frame it as a family obligation, a duty I couldn't shirk without looking selfish or ungrateful. And Karen? She acted like it was her right, like my money was just another resource for her to tap into whenever she felt like it. It wasn't long before the resentment started to build. I hated the way my mom guilt-tripped me, the way Karen took advantage of my kindness, and the way I let myself be manipulated into going along with it. I felt like a bank account with a heartbeat, valuable only for what I could give. Something had to change. I couldn't keep draining my finances for Karen's benefit while she lived like a queen. But what could I do? Every time I tried to stand up for myself, my mom doubled down, and Karen just kept spending. That's when I decided to start digging. If my mom was going to keep forcing me into this role, I needed to understand why. What was really going on behind the scenes? Why was Karen so financially irresponsible? And more importantly, why was my mom so determined to make me fix it? I didn't know it yet, but I was about to uncover a secret that would change everything. It was a quiet evening when I saw the social media post that changed everything. I was scrolling mindlessly through Instagram, trying to decompress from a long day, when Karen's latest photo popped up. There she was, posing with a brand new designer handbag, the kind that cost more than my monthly rent. Her caption read, "You deserve the finer things in life." #blessed. For a moment, I just stared at the screen, wondering if I'd somehow misunderstood. But no, there it was, clear as day. Karen, flaunting her latest splurge, while I was draining my bank account to cover her so-called emergencies. My chest tightened with anger as I scrolled through her profile, looking at her recent posts. Dinner at a high-end restaurant, a weekend spa retreat, a shopping spree with bags from all the top luxury brands. I couldn't take it anymore. This wasn't someone struggling to make ends meet. This was someone exploiting my kindness, using my hard-earned money to live a lifestyle I couldn't even afford for myself. That night, I called my mom. The anger in my voice must have been obvious, because she skipped the usual pleasantries and jumped straight to, "What's wrong? What's wrong?" I repeated, my voice shaking. "Mom, Karen just posted a picture of a handbag that costs more than my rent. Meanwhile, I'm over here paying her bills. Do you even know what's going on?" My mom sighed, the kind of sigh that usually preceded a guilt trip. "Honey, Karen's been under a lot of stress lately. Treating herself to something nice is her way of coping. You can't expect her to give up every little thing." "Coping?" I snapped. "She's coping with my money. I'm over here cutting back on my own expenses so she can live it up. This isn't fair, Mom." "She's family," my mom said, her voice firm. "And family helps each other. I don't understand why you're making such a big deal out of this. You're doing fine financially, aren't you?" "That's not the point." I shot back. "The point is that this isn't my responsibility. Karen's bills aren't my problem, and I'm done pretending they are." My mom didn't take it well. She launched into a tirade about how ungrateful I was, how selfish I was being for refusing to help someone in need. She brought up every sacrifice she'd ever made for me growing up, every time she'd gone without so I could have what I needed. "You owe this family," she said, her voice dripping with disappointment. "Karen has been there for me in ways you'll never understand, and the least you can do is help her out. Do you think this is easy for her? She's trying her best." Her words stung, but they didn't shake my resolve. I'd spent weeks letting guilt and obligation dictate my actions, and I was done. "Mom," I said, cutting her off mid-rant, "I love you, but this isn't my problem to fix. Karen needs to take responsibility for her own life, and you need to stop enabling her. I'm not paying another dime." The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. For a moment, I thought she might hang up on me. Then she said, "Fine. If you want to be that way, don't expect any help from me when you need it." I almost laughed at the irony. "Help from you?" I said. "Mom, I've been supporting myself for years. The only thing I've ever asked for is to not be dragged into Karen's mess. But if that's how you feel, fine." When I hung up, I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. Standing up to my mom wasn't easy, and a part of me worried about the fallout. Would she hold this against me forever? Would it drive a wedge between us? But another part of me felt lighter, like I'd finally broken free from the weight of expectations that had been crushing me for so long. In the days that followed, I braced myself for the inevitable fallout. My mom sent a few passive-aggressive texts, hinting that I was letting the family down, but I didn't respond. For the first time in weeks, I focused on myself, my own bills, my own goals, and my own peace of mind. But even as I tried to move forward, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this situation than I understood. Why was my mom so insistent on protecting Karen? Why was she so quick to pass the burden on to me? I decided it was time to dig deeper. If my mom and Karen weren't going to give me answers, I'd find them myself. The decision to dig into the financial mess was born out of frustration, but also a gnawing curiosity. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this situation than my mom was letting on. Her insistence on me paying Karen's bills wasn't just unreasonable. It felt deliberate, like she was hiding something. I started by revisiting the family's shared account, something we'd set up years ago when I was still in college. Back then, the account had been used for shared expenses, things like holiday trips or emergencies. Once I became financially independent, I left it alone, trusting my mom to manage it responsibly. When I logged in for the first time in years, my heart sank. The balance, which had once been comfortably in the five-figure range, was now dangerously low. I scrolled through the transactions, my confusion quickly turning into anger. It was all there in black and white. Withdrawals for Karen's gym membership, payments to high-end boutiques, subscriptions to luxury beauty boxes, and even a transfer to a car dealership. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Karen's lifestyle wasn't just excessive, it was being funded directly from the family account. My initial shock gave way to a bitter realization. This was why my mom had been so adamant about me stepping in. She hadn't just been trying to help Karen. She'd been enabling her, draining the family's resources in the process. And now that the account was nearly empty, she needed someone else to pick up the slack. I kept scrolling, my frustration mounting with every unnecessary expense I uncovered. It wasn't just Karen, though she was clearly the primary beneficiary. There were also payments that I suspected were for my mom. Spa visits, fancy dinners, and trips I hadn't been told about. The whole thing felt like a betrayal. Armed with this new information, I started looking deeper into Karen's spending habits. Her social media posts were practically a roadmap of her indulgences, expensive vacations, shopping sprees, and elaborate meals. I began matching her posts with the transaction dates, and sure enough, everything lined up. The more I uncovered, the angrier I became. It wasn't just about the money. It was the audacity of it all. Karen had been living like a queen while I struggled to pay her bills, and my mom had been complicit in the whole thing. They'd both taken advantage of my willingness to help, and they'd done it without a shred of guilt. It wasn't just about Karen anymore. My mom, the person I'd always trusted to do right by the family, had been lying to me. She'd made me feel like I was selfish and ungrateful for questioning her demands, all while hiding the truth about where the money was going. I decided it was time to confront her, but I needed more leverage first. So I kept digging, combing through every transaction, every withdrawal, and every payment tied to Karen or my mom. I printed out the most damning evidence and highlighted the patterns of spending that were impossible to justify. It wasn't just Karen's gym memberships or her designer handbags. There were also multiple cash withdrawals with no clear purpose, payments to obscure online stores, and even a few transactions labeled as gifts. It was clear that this wasn't a one-time mistake. This was a sustained pattern of abuse. By the time I was done, I had a stack of evidence that painted a clear picture of what had been happening. Karen wasn't just irresponsible, she was reckless. And my mom wasn't just enabling her, she was actively covering for her. That night, I sat down and replayed every conversation I'd had with my mom over the past few months. Every guilt trip, every lecture about family loyalty, every time she'd insisted that I step up. It all made sense now. She wasn't trying to protect the family. She was trying to protect herself. But now the game had changed. I wasn't the naive, obliging child she could manipulate anymore. I had the truth on my side, and I was ready to use it. The next step was clear. I had to confront my mom and make her answer for what she'd done. If she thought she could keep hiding behind guilt trips and excuses, she was about to get a rude awakening. I didn't know exactly how she would react, but one thing was certain, I wasn't backing down this time. The more I unraveled the truth about the family account, the more obvious it became that I needed to take action. Karen and my mom had drained the funds with reckless abandon, using the money for indulgences they didn't even bother to hide. It was infuriating, but I wasn't completely powerless. What my mom didn't know was that I still had access to the family account, and I wasn't afraid to use it. Years ago, when we first set up the account, I'd insisted on putting a few safeguards in place. At the time, it seemed unnecessary, more of a just-in-case measure than anything else. But now, those safeguards felt like my secret weapon. I had full administrative control over the account, including the ability to monitor transactions, freeze withdrawals, and redirect funds to a backup savings account I'd set up years ago. I spent hours going through the transactions, combing through every charge and transfer with meticulous precision. Each line item painted a clearer picture of just how far things had spiraled out of control. Spa days, shopping sprees, high-end dinners, and even a few boutique hotel stays, all of it tied to Karen. I wasn't just angry anymore. I was determined. After printing out the most incriminating transactions, I set up monitoring alerts on the account. From now on, any attempt to withdraw or transfer funds would send a notification straight to my phone. I also redirected a portion of the remaining balance into the backup savings account, ensuring that whatever money was left would be protected. This wasn't about being petty. It was about accountability. My mom and Karen had taken advantage of me for months, and it was time for them to face the consequences. I sat back, staring at the stack of evidence I compiled. Each highlighted charge felt like another piece of ammunition, proof that I wasn't imagining things or overreacting. They'd crossed a line, and now it was my turn to set the record straight. The confrontation took place the following weekend. I showed up at my mom's house unannounced, armed with the evidence and a resolve I hadn't felt in years. She greeted me at the door with her usual warm smile, but it faltered when she saw the expression on my face. "What's wrong?" she asked, her tone wary. "We need to talk," I said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. I headed straight for the dining table and laid the stack of papers down in front of her. She looked at the papers, then back at me. "What's all this?" "It's proof," I said, my voice steady. "Proof that the family account has been drained to fund Karen's lifestyle. Proof that you've been covering for her while trying to make me pick up the slack." Her face went pale, and for a moment, she didn't say anything. Then she tried to laugh it off. "You're being ridiculous. Karen's had a few hard months, that's all. This isn't as big of a deal as you're making it out to be." "Hard months?" I snapped, pointing to one of the highlighted charges. "She spent $300 on a spa day while I was paying her utility bills. She bought a designer bag that costs more than my rent. And you let her, Mom? You let her do all of this while you guilt-tripped me into covering her basic expenses." My mom's expression hardened. "It's not like that," she said defensively. Karen's going through a rough time. She needed support, and I did what I had to do to help her. At my expense, I said. You didn't just help her. You enabled her. And now the account is almost empty because of it. Did you really think I wouldn't find out? She sat down heavily, her hands trembling as she flipped through the papers. I could tell she was struggling to come up with a response, but I didn't give her the chance. I've already set up safeguards on the account, I continued. From now on, I'll get alerts for any transactions, and I've moved what's left of the money into a protected savings account. You and Karen can't touch it anymore. Her head snapped up, her eyes wide. You had no right to do that. I had every right, I said firmly. It's a family account, and I'm part of this family too. You've been irresponsible with the money, and I'm not going to let it happen anymore. For the first time, my mom looked genuinely panicked. Karen needs that money, she said, her voice trembling. No, I said, my tone resolute. Karen needs to take responsibility for her own life. You've spent months enabling her behavior, and now you're both going to have to deal with the consequences. The rest of the conversation was a blur of accusations, denials, and half-hearted justifications. My mom tried to shift the blame onto me, claiming I was being heartless and selfish. But her words didn't carry the same weight they used to. For the first time, I felt like I was in control of the situation. When I left her house that day, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt exhausted. But I also felt a sense of relief, knowing that I'd finally taken a stand. The family account was safe, Karen's spending spree was over, and my mom couldn't guilt-trip me anymore. I knew there would be fallout. My mom wouldn't let this go easily, and Karen would probably be furious when she found out. But I was ready. I had the truth on my side, and for the first time in months, I felt like I was back in control. The drive to my mom's house was tense, the evidence sitting in the passenger seat beside me like a co-pilot urging me forward. I had replayed the confrontation in my head so many times that the words felt rehearsed, but my hands still gripped the steering wheel tighter than they should have. Confronting my mom wasn't something I ever thought I'd have to do, but the betrayal was too deep to let slide. When I knocked on the door, she answered with her usual warm smile, but it quickly faded when she saw the look on my face. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. "Can I come in?" I replied, my tone calm but firm. She stepped aside, and I walked straight to the dining table without waiting for an invitation. I pulled out the stack of account statements and spread them out across the table, each page a glaring indictment of what had been happening. My mom stood frozen for a moment before joining me at the table, her eyes darting between the papers and my face. "What is all this?" she asked, her voice wavering slightly. "This," I said, pointing to the documents, "is proof that the family account has been drained to fund Karen's lifestyle. And I want to know why." At first, she tried to play dumb. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice rising defensively. I tapped one of the statements, my finger landing on a transaction for a designer boutique. "You don't know what I'm talking about? Then how do you explain this? Or this?" I flipped to another page, highlighting charges for spa days and expensive dinners. Her face turned red as she scanned the pages, her mouth opening and closing like she was searching for an excuse. "It's not what it looks like," she finally said. "Really?" I shot back, my voice rising. "Because it looks like you've been using the family account to fund Karen's shopping sprees while pretending she's struggling. Do you even hear yourself, Mom?" "I was just trying to help Karen," she said, her voice defensive now. "She's been going through a tough time." I leaned forward, my anger bubbling over. "Struggling? Tough time? Mom, she's buying designer bags and posting them online with captions like, 'Treat yourself.' That's not struggling. That's taking advantage." She sighed heavily, sinking into one of the dining chairs. "You don't understand," she said quietly. "Then explain it to me," I demanded. She hesitated, her eyes darting toward the door, as if she were looking for an escape. Finally, she admitted the truth. Karen's had some financial trouble. She got behind on her bills, and I didn't want her to lose the house or the car. So, I used the account to help her out. I didn't think it would get this bad. I shook my head in disbelief. "This isn't about keeping a roof over her head, Mom. She's spending money like it grows on trees, and you've been enabling her. Do you even realize how much you've drained from the account?" She avoided my gaze, fiddling with the corner of one of the papers. "I just wanted to help," she murmured. "Well, you didn't just help her. You hurt me in the process," I said, my voice cracking. "Do you have any idea how hard I've worked to save money, only to have you and Karen guilt me into spending it on her bills? You made me feel like I was selfish for saying no, and all the while, you were hiding this." My mom looked genuinely shaken, but I wasn't done. "I've already put safeguards on the account," I said. From now on, you and Karen won't have access to the remaining funds. If you want to help her, you'll have to do it with your own money." Her head snapped up, her expression shifting from guilt to indignation. "You had no right to do that," she said sharply. "I had every right," I countered. "I'm part of this family, and I'm not going to stand by while you let Karen bleed us dry. Someone had to take responsibility, and clearly, it wasn't going to be you." The room fell silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. For the first time, I saw my mom not as the unshakable figure I'd grown up with, but as someone flawed and vulnerable. It was a strange, almost surreal moment, but it didn't change the fact that she'd betrayed my trust. Eventually, she sighed, her shoulders slumping in defeat. "You're right," she said softly. "I let it get out of hand. I didn't know how to say no to her. She's been through so much, and I thought I could fix it." "You can't fix it, Mom," I said gently. "Not by throwing money at the problem. Karen needs to take responsibility for her own life, and you need to stop enabling her. This isn't just about money. It's about boundaries." She nodded slowly, but I could tell it would take time for her to fully process everything. As I gathered up the papers and prepared to leave, I felt a strange mix of emotions: anger, sadness, and relief. This confrontation had been a long time coming, and while it hadn't solved everything, it was a step in the right direction. My mom might not have liked what I had to say, but for the first time, I felt like she truly understood where I was coming from. As I walked out the door, I took a deep breath, letting the cool air calm my nerves. The fight wasn't over, but I wasn't backing down. Not now, not ever. As I sat across the table from my mom, the tension between us felt like a live wire. She was still reeling from the confrontation, her initial defensiveness giving way to a mix of guilt and unease. But I wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. There was one last thing she needed to know, and I was prepared for the fallout. "I've made some changes to the family account," I said, my voice calm but firm. Her brow furrowed, and she tilted her head, clearly not understanding. "What changes?" "I put safeguards in place," I explained. "From now on, I'll get alerts for every transaction, and no one can withdraw funds without my approval. I've also moved a portion of the remaining money into a separate savings account to make sure it's protected." My mom's reaction was immediate. Her face went pale, and her eyes widened in shock. "You did what?" she asked, her voice shaking. "I took control," I said simply. "Someone has to make sure the money's being used responsibly. And since you've clearly failed to do that, it's up to me now." For the first time in my life, I saw my mom completely speechless. She'd always been the one in charge, the one who made the rules and expected everyone else to follow them. But now, the power dynamic had shifted, and she didn't know how to handle it. "You had no right," she said finally, her voice trembling with anger. "I had every right," I shot back. "It's a family account, and I'm part of this family too. I trusted you to manage it responsibly, and you let Karen drain it dry. If you won't step up and protect what's left, then I will." She stared at me, her mouth opening and closing like she wanted to argue, but couldn't find the words. Finally, she leaned back in her chair, letting out a bitter laugh. "You think you know everything, don't you?" "This isn't about knowing everything," I said, leaning forward. "It's about doing the right thing. Karen's behavior is out of control, and you've been enabling her. If you won't hold her accountable, then I will." The realization of her lost control seemed to hit her all at once. She crossed her arms, her gaze darting to the stack of account statements still sitting on the table. "Do you have any idea how hard it's been for me?" she said, her voice cracking. "Trying to keep this family together? Trying to help Karen while making sure everything else doesn't fall apart?" "I do know," I said softly. "And I know that you've been carrying too much for too long. But enabling Karen isn't the solution. You're not helping her. You're just making things worse for both of you." Her eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. But then I remembered how she'd guilt-tripped me into covering Karen's bills, how she'd let me believe I was being selfish for wanting to keep my own money. "This isn't just about Karen," I continued. "It's about boundaries. You've been letting her take advantage of you, and now you're trying to pass that burden on to me. I won't let that happen anymore." My mom looked down at her hands, her expression a mix of anger and defeat. "She's my best friend," she said quietly. "She was there for me when no one else was. I can't just abandon her." "I'm not asking you to abandon her," I said. "But there's a difference between helping someone and enabling them. Karen needs to take responsibility for her own life, and you need to let her. Otherwise, this cycle will never end." The room was silent for a long time, the only sound the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Finally, my mom let out a deep sigh and nodded. I don't like this, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But I understand why you did it. I'm glad you do, I said, standing up and gathering the papers. Because from now on, things are going to be different. As I walked toward the door, my mom called out to me. Wait. I turned back, meeting her gaze. She hesitated, then sighed. I don't know how to fix this. With Karen, she's going to be furious. Let her be furious, I said, shrugging. She's been living on everyone else's dime for long enough. It's time she learned how to stand on her own 2 feet. My mom didn't respond, but the look in her eyes told me she knew I was right. As I left the house, I felt a strange sense of relief. For the first time in months, I felt like I was finally in control, not just of the family finances, but of my own life. The power shift wasn't just about money. It was about standing up for myself, setting boundaries, and refusing to let guilt dictate my decisions. My mom might not have liked it, and Karen certainly wouldn't, but I didn't care. This was the beginning of a new chapter, one where I called the shots. The aftermath of my confrontation with my mom unfolded like a domino effect, each event triggering a chain reaction throughout the family. By the time I'd returned home that evening, word of what had happened was already spreading. My mom, unsurprisingly, had turned to other relatives for sympathy, painting herself as the victim of my harsh and unnecessary actions. Calls and texts started pouring in. Some relatives scolded me for being disrespectful to my mom and for turning my back on family. One aunt lectured me for nearly an hour, accusing me of abandoning my mom and Karen when they needed me most. She didn't seem to care about the facts, just the optics of me standing up to my mom. But there were others who saw things differently. A cousin I hadn't spoken to in years called me out of the blue to say, "Good for you. Someone needed to put a stop to this." A few other relatives quietly confided that they'd noticed the same patterns with my mom and Karen and had always felt powerless to intervene. The responses were a mixed bag, but I was prepared for that. When you challenge a long-standing family dynamic, not everyone is going to be on your side. Still, I couldn't help but feel vindicated by the messages of support. It reminded me that I wasn't crazy for taking a stand. Karen, predictably, didn't take the news well. It only took her a day to realize that her access to the family account had been cut off, and when she did, she went into full meltdown mode. She called me repeatedly, leaving angry voicemails that ranged from defensive to downright insulting. "How dare you cut me off?" she yelled in one message. "I've done nothing but support this family, and this is how you repay me?" Another voicemail was more desperate. "You don't understand what this is doing to me. I can't pay my bills without that money. You need to fix this." I didn't respond to any of her calls. I wasn't interested in arguing with someone who had spent months taking advantage of me. Karen's sense of entitlement was staggering, and I wasn't about to waste my energy trying to reason with her. Instead, I focused on setting firm boundaries. I blocked her number after the third voicemail and made it clear to my mom that I wouldn't entertain any more discussions about Karen's finances. If she has a problem, she can figure it out herself, I told her. I'm done. With no access to the family account and no financial support from me, Karen had no choice but to start making changes. From what I heard through the family grapevine, it was a rude awakening. She had to sell her car, a flashy SUV she'd bought brand new, and downsize to something more affordable. The gym membership and subscription boxes were canceled, and the shopping sprees came to an abrupt halt. Karen even had to pick up extra shifts at her part-time job to make ends meet, something she hadn't done in years. The image she'd carefully cultivated on social media, one of luxury and indulgence, started to crack. Her once frequent posts about spa days and designer bags were replaced with vague complaints about how hard life was getting. At first, I felt a little guilty when I heard about her struggles. Despite everything, I didn't want to see anyone suffer. But then I reminded myself that Karen's situation was a result of her own choices. She'd been living beyond her means for years, and it was about time she faced the consequences. My mom, meanwhile, was forced to confront her own role in the chaos. Without the family account as a safety net, she couldn't bail Karen out anymore. At first, she tried to guilt me into reconsidering, but when she saw that I wasn't budging, she gave up. "I don't know how we got here," she said during one of our more civil conversations. "You got here by enabling her," I replied. "This didn't happen overnight, Mom. You've been making excuses for Karen for years, and now it's finally catching up to her. And to you." She didn't have a response to that, but I could tell my words were sinking in. For the first time, I saw her start to take responsibility for the mess she'd helped create. It wasn't an instant transformation, but it was a start. Not everyone in the family was happy with the changes, but I wasn't looking for universal approval. What mattered most was that the cycle of enabling and financial irresponsibility had been broken. Karen couldn't rely on the family account anymore, and my mom was learning to set healthier boundaries. As for me, I finally felt free. Free from the guilt, the manipulation, and the endless demands for money. It wasn't an easy journey, but it was worth it. The fallout might have been messy, but it was also necessary. Sometimes the only way to fix a broken system is to tear it down completely, and that's exactly what I'd done. In the weeks following the confrontation, I had a lot of time to reflect. The dust had settled, and while things between me and my mom were far from perfect, they were at least civil. Karen had mostly faded into the background of my life, which was exactly where I wanted her. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again, free from the constant weight of obligations that weren't mine to carry. This whole ordeal taught me lessons I hadn't anticipated. The most significant was about boundaries, not just setting them, but enforcing them, even when it's hard. Growing up, my mom had always been the authority in the family, the person everyone looked to for guidance. Standing up to her felt unnatural, even wrong, but it was the only way to break the cycle. It wasn't easy. Confronting someone you love is one of the hardest things you can do, especially when they genuinely believe they're in the right. My mom wasn't trying to hurt me. She just didn't see the harm in her actions. She thought she was keeping the family together, but in reality, she was tearing it apart by enabling Karen's behavior and dragging me into the mess. Another lesson I learned was about responsibility, specifically how far it should go. For years, I'd taken on the role of the responsible one in the family without question. I paid my own way, helped out when I could, and never expected anything in return. But somewhere along the line, that responsibility had turned into a burden. My mom and Karen didn't see me as someone who could help. They saw me as someone who should help, no matter the cost. They assumed that because I was stable and independent, I owed it to them to bail them out. And for a while, I believed it too. But there's a difference between being responsible and being taken advantage of. It's not selfish to say no when something feels wrong. It's not ungrateful to set limits on what you're willing to give. I realized that I wasn't just standing up for myself. I was teaching them how to respect me. Saying no was one of the hardest things I've ever done, but it was also the most liberating. For years, I'd been so afraid of disappointing my mom or causing a rift in the family that I let myself be manipulated. But when I finally stood my ground, I felt a strength I didn't know I had. The aftermath wasn't pretty, but it was necessary. Karen learned the hard way that she couldn't rely on others to fund her lifestyle. From what I've heard through the family grapevine, she's been forced to make some tough decisions, selling her expensive car, downsizing her home, and picking up more work to cover her bills. I don't take pleasure in her struggles, but I can't deny that a part of me feels vindicated. Karen needed a reality check, and while it wasn't my job to give it to her, I'm glad she finally got one. Whether she's truly learned her lesson, I can't say. But at the very least, she knows she can't come to me for help anymore. As for my mom, our relationship has changed in ways I'm still figuring out. The power dynamic is different now, more balanced. And while she hasn't explicitly apologized for what happened, I can tell she regrets how things played out. She's more careful with her words, less likely to guilt-trip me or make demands she knows I won't entertain. I've learned to keep my guard up around her, not because I don't trust her, but because I know how easily old patterns can resurface. Our conversations are lighter now, focused on neutral topics like work or the weather. It's not the close bond we once had, but it feels healthier in its own way. Looking back, I'm grateful for the lessons this experience taught me. It wasn't just about money, it was about valuing myself and my boundaries. For so long, I'd let guilt and obligation dictate my decisions, but now I know better. The truth is, the people you love aren't always going to act in your best interest. Sometimes, they'll take advantage of you, not out of malice, but because they assume you'll always say yes. It's up to you to decide where the line is and to hold firm when someone crosses it. To anyone facing a similar situation, my advice is simple. Don't let guilt keep you from standing up for yourself. Setting boundaries isn't selfish, it's necessary. And sometimes the hardest thing you can do is the most important. At the end of the day, my mom and Karen will do what they want. Whether they've truly learned to be more responsible with their spending, I can't say. But one thing's for sure, it's no longer my problem. I've taken back control of my life, and that's a lesson I'll carry with me forever. The freedom I feel now is something I never realized I was missing. For years, I let guilt, obligation, and the fear of disappointing others control my decisions. I thought saying yes made me a better person, a better family member. But now I understand that saying no setting boundaries was the best decision I ever made. My life looks very different these days. I live in a cozy apartment that I've made entirely my own, filled with things that reflect who I am and what I love. There's a sense of pride that comes with knowing everything I earned on my own. My finances are no longer tied up in other people's messes. Instead, I've been able to focus on investing in my future, building an emergency fund, and even treating myself once in a while without feeling guilty. I still talk to my mom, but our relationship has changed. It's less about her telling me what to do and more about mutual respect, something I never thought we'd achieve. I've made it clear that my generosity has limits, and while she sometimes pushes those boundaries, I've learned how to stand firm. Every now and then, I hear updates about Karen through the family grapevine. Apparently, she's doing better now, though her lifestyle has undergone a significant downgrade. She no longer drives a luxury car or spends her weekends shopping at designer stores. Instead, she's had to learn the value of budgeting and living within her means. It's almost comical to think back to her social media posts from those days. The endless photos of designer bags, spa days, and extravagant meals now feel like relics of a life she couldn't afford but desperately wanted everyone to believe she had. Every time I think about it, I can't help but laugh. Karen thought she could live the high life on my dime, but in the end, I had the last laugh. She learned the hard way that entitlement doesn't pay the bills, and that relying on others to fund your lifestyle comes with an expiration date. If there's one thing I've learned from this experience, it's the importance of putting yourself first. For so long, I let guilt and family pressure dictate my choices, afraid of what would happen if I disappointed the people I loved. But the truth is, you can't pour from an empty cup. If you give everything you have to others, there's nothing left for yourself. Setting boundaries wasn't just about protecting my finances, it was about protecting my peace of mind. Saying no didn't make me selfish. It made me strong. It showed me that I could prioritize my own needs without feeling guilty, and that my worth wasn't tied to how much I was willing to give. To anyone reading this, here's my advice. Don't let guilt or family pressure force you into situations that drain you, emotionally, financially, or otherwise. Stand your ground, set boundaries, and never underestimate the power of saying no. Sometimes that's the best way to truly take control. Moving forward, I've made a promise to myself. I will never let anyone make me feel like my kindness is a weakness. I will help where I can, but I will not sacrifice my own well-being for someone else's poor choices. Life isn't perfect, but it's mine, and that's all I've ever wanted. The days of worrying about Karen's bills or my mom's demands are over, replaced with a focus on my own goals and happiness. I've built a life I'm proud of, a life that's entirely my own. And honestly, that's the best revenge of all.